Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. President Lee Jae Myung has returned from a 4-day state visit to China, his first since taking office. In a rare live press luncheon, he called China a vital neighbor and pushed for a new balanced relationship based on mutual benefit and respect. He also touched on key issues such as maritime tensions, North Korea, and the long-standing cultural import ban. But beyond policy, he also warned against rising anti-China and anti-Korea sentiment. For a deeper analysis of the latest visit and on how Seoul plans to manage its future relations with Beijing, we are joined in the studio by Mason Richey, Professor of International Politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. A big welcome, Professor.
Great, thanks for having me. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, too. And also joining us online is Min Jung-hoon, Professor at the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. Good to see you, Professor.
Good evening. Happy New Year.
Good evening, Professor. So let's start the discussion right away. Like I've said, President Lee described his latest visit as a major diplomatic step, and he said that it helped solidify Korea's national interest in a shifting global order. So, Professor Min, from your perspective, what stood out the most for you? And also, would you call his trip a diplomatic success?
Yes, personally, I think that President Lee's stated visit to China this time is a big diplomatic success. As you know, Lee Jae Myung government pursues national interest-driven pragmatic diplomacy, and it laid the foundation over the first 6 months in office. Specifically, its pragmatic diplomacy is based on the robust ROK-US alliance, and the Lee government successfully addressed key issues between South Korea and US, such as tariff negotiations and alliance modernization, and it further strengthened the alliance. And the Lee government's pragmatic diplomacy also pursues the favorable balance of power for South Korea in East Asia. And it restored and developed relationships with the core countries like Japan and China during the past 6 months. In addition, the government hosted and attended multilateral summits, such as South Korea ASEAN Summit, the APEC Summit, and the G20 Summit, and established the foundation for the pragmatic diplomacy to extend beyond the Korean Peninsula and into the Indo-Pacific and the whole world. So based on the achievements of the first 6 months, a Lee government is necessary to move forward to concretize the pragmatic diplomacy. And each first step was to enhance each relationship with China. And by successfully having the bilateral summit with China and establishing the solid foundation of favorably maintaining the relationship between the two countries, Lee government has gathered momentum to solidify South Korea's national interest in a shifting, unstable global order. Literally, it has got the jumping moment for its national interest-driven pragmatic diplomacy.
Indeed, the latest visit definitely seemed very meaningful in terms of diplomacy. And during the press luncheon, President Lee even called China a vital neighbor across all fields, the economy, security, and even culture. Professor Richey, what would you read into this choice of words?
It's an interesting formulation, actually. It sort of combines two separate thoughts. In diplomatic language, vital is usually considered to be the sort of highest ranking of state interest. I may be missing some here, but I think we usually think it's a vital interest. It comes from the Latin for life, right? It's important for the life of your state, for the existence of your state, and then core interest, and then critical interest, and then important interest, and peripheral interest. So it's an interesting use of the term vital. And then the term neighbor, of course, is interesting, and it really made me kind of think of this famous phrase that we sometimes talk about in diplomacy: you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your neighbors. And China's here; it's not going anywhere. 1.4 billion people, right across the sea, is indeed not far, and there's nothing you can do about that. And I would also sort of couple that notion of neighbor with what Lee Jae Myung said after his return, where he sort of paraphrased the famous quote from Lord Palmerston, saying that there are no permanent friends, no permanent enemies in international politics. And so it's a sort of interesting formulation that I think if you sort of wrap it all up together, ultimately is just a way of sort of acknowledging the fact that, Korea has a vital interest in maintaining stable and even growing relations with its neighbor who's not going anywhere. Obviously, that doesn't diminish the importance of the relationship with the United States, as Professor Min just mentioned, and obviously right now the foundation for South Korea's prosperity and security obviously is still in Washington. But especially given right now the way that we see the United States acting on the world stage and the degree to which the world is in flux right now, building relations out with China is obviously of critical importance or vital importance, as President Lee said.
So it really shows how much importance the Lee administration is putting to China. And in fact, he also looked back at the old Korea-China dynamic, saying Korea with a capital and tech, where China has the labor and land, saying that that model has run its course. Professor Min, then what kind of updated framework is President Lee trying to build on from now?
Yes, as you mentioned, regarding the economic cooperation between South Korea and China, it used to have a vertical division of labor structure, which is specialized Korea with the capital and technology, and China with the labor and land. But it does not work anymore. It means that China has been a major trading partner for South Korea, but the bilateral economic relationship has been shifting from a vertical division of labor to a horizontal cooperative structure. Now, South Korea faces the challenge of maintaining horizontal competition and cooperation with China in economic and technological areas. So we can call it competitive cooperation or cooperative competition relationship. So South Korea is trying to build a mutual beneficial relationship where the two countries, South Korea and China, can enhance cooperation in substantive areas such as economic, technological, cultural, and people-to-people exchanges. For example, during this summit meeting, business partners of the two countries made 14 MOUs in the areas of consumer goods, contents, and supply chain. So South Korea and China are expected to focus on improving their bilateral relationship through the practical cooperation in the coming years. And I think there is a shared understanding between the two countries on restoring and developing their relationships. So it is likely that they will try to avoid conflict and friction and increase cooperation in practical areas such as economy, technology, supply chain, culture, and people-to-people exchanges that can benefit the people in both countries.
A lot of agreements have been made through the latest visit. And as Professor Min has mentioned, of course, China is one of South Korea's biggest trading partners indeed. Professor Richey, did you hear anything that points to a concrete direction in terms of economic cooperation between the two?
I'm going to come to your question, but first I want to get back to something that you began your last question with, and then that Professor Min brought up, and that is indeed the world in which China's low-cost labor and land, and South Korea is high-tech and capital. Indeed, that's over. And I was just in China last October, and it's fascinating. You don't see Hyundai and Kia cars on the road, almost none. I think I could count on one hand the number of cars that I saw from Korean manufacturers during my 5 or 6 days that I was there. You don't see Samsung smartphones. You don't see large billboards advertising K-pop or Korean beauty products. China has grown enormously in terms of its ability to provide these high-tech and especially also consumer high-tech goods for itself. And so indeed, I think Professor Min's exactly right that we're now in a world where China and South Korea have a relationship economically that involves as much competition as it does complementarity. And maybe that's a sort of frame, I guess, for my larger answer to your question. We didn't see a joint press statement or a joint communique come out of this meeting. That's not a surprise. I think it's been more than a decade since we've had a leader-level meeting there that produced this type of joint communique. So we're left kind of looking at the things that were said from either one side or in terms of the MOUs that were signed, which the professor just brought up. And I think we see how South Korea's statements, Lee's statements, talked about in some sense, taking the first step towards revitalizing a relationship economically that began to decline in part with the THAAD controversy and China's retaliation against South Korean imports as a result of that. So this was back in 2016 and 2017, and some of that remains the case today. And then obviously COVID, but of course China's own endogenous growth, as I mentioned earlier. The statements that we saw come out of this meeting involved, economic security, supply chains, digital trade, intellectual property rights. Those are all important things, as are some of those MOUs, but none of them strike me as being particularly groundbreaking. And so I think the question when you're looking forward is what it is, at least from a South Korean perspective, what it is that South Korea wants from its economic relationship with China. If it wants greater access to China's consumer market, I fear that that's not really going to happen. Not only because of perhaps political differences, but also because, as we said, China has grown and it's able to do a lot of that itself. Also, China isn't growing its consumer part of the pie, right? It's still focused on export industry. It's still focused on trying to produce as large a positive balance of trade as it can. If South Korea is looking for inputs from China, of course, there's a lot of room there, of course. But even then, we have to pay attention to the fact that China can change on a dime. We've just seen China put dual-use restrictions on products that it has been selling to Japan. And I think the last sort of part of the puzzle is we won't really know what the parameters are for the South Korea-China relationship, I think, until we hopefully have a China-U.S. summit later this year in April, where we'll get some of the basic framework, for instance, on what type of high-tech trade U.S. allies can engage with China.
Mm-hmm. So we will need to wait a little bit for more detailed issues. Now, of course, during the meeting, during the visit, some thornier issues came up as well, like the China-Japan export controls and the situation in the West Sea. Professor Min, how do you think Seoul is trying to position itself amid these growing regional tensions?
Well, it would not be easy anyway, but along with the successful summit meeting with the presidency, it is known that President Lee will visit Japan next week. As you know, China and Japan are important partners for South Korea, and therefore it's necessary for South Korea to maintain good relationships with both countries. Well, of course, some people argue that it's necessary for South Korea to take an active mediating role to resolve the ongoing conflict between China and Japan. But as President Lee Jae Myung mentioned, South Korea does not have a few things can do to resolve the conflict. The two countries are showing no signs of backing down on the key issue, Taiwan contingency. In addition, the two countries' emotions are deeply and sensitively opposed, so it's not appropriate for South Korea to take a side between the two countries. It'll just make the situation worse. So I think South Korea needs to be neutral and cautious in making any comments and diplomatic moves about the tensions. Instead, South Korea needed to take some time and try to improve bilateral relationships with China and Japan respectively, and needed to make a grounded space that the two countries can rely on to relieve the tensions. And based on the enhanced bilateral relationships, South Korea will be able to offer a trilateral meeting with China and Japan in order to deal with the major regional matters like North Korea and trade. And the South Korea can play a mediating role and provide the opportunity that the two countries will resume the dialogue. And by talking about less or non-sensitive issues at their multilateral format, they will be able to find the diplomatic space where they can resume their bilateral talks. And in return, such a role in enhance South Korea's regional standing and contribute to establishing a favorable balance of power for South Korea in East Asia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that opinion, Professor. Let's also touch upon the security front now. President Lee also said that he directly asked China to play a more active role when it comes to North Korea, especially regarding its nuclear issue, of course. Professor, how do you interpret Beijing's response to this? And do you think China is actually willing to step in?
Well, it's not certain how actively China can step in the process. But anyway, it is known that President Lee asked the President Xi to take a mediating role on North Korea. And the President Xi responded that it needs patience. I think it means that China will willingly be a mediator, but it will take time to resolve the North Korean problem. When the two countries held a summit meeting in Gyeongju last November, China expressed its willingness to cooperate for peaceful coexistence and shared prosperity on the Korean Peninsula. And it also reaffirmed its commitment to fostering a positive atmosphere for dialogue between U.S. and North Korea. So it is likely that Lee Jae Myung government is trying to implement Namdong-Mijung negotiation where four countries, South Korea, North Korea, U.S., and China, will actively participate in the negotiation on the North Korean matter. Specifically, there would be a bilateral negotiation between North Korea and U.S., and South Korea and China will take mediating and facilitating roles. South Korea will actively cooperate with the U.S. and play a central role in creating specific conditions that North Korea can come back to the negotiating table. And China will deliver what U.S. and South Korea create to North Korea and facilitate Pyongyang to resume the talks with Washington. So, of course, it's not clear whether North Korea will show any active response to what I said about the negotiation. But anyway, right now, Namdong-Mijung negotiations are expected to raise the possibility that North Korea and the U.S. will resume their dialogue.
So close coordination with Washington would be very important for South Korea. Now, speaking of which, in the area, Northeast Asia, President Lee also talked about building a long-term peace in the area while acknowledging that there still remains some historic disputes. Professor Richey, given this kind of historical baggage, how much room is there for real multilateral cooperation in the region?
Well, I guess that sort of means might depend on what you mean by multilateral. South Korea has a blossoming security relationship with Japan and the United States in a trilateral context. One sometimes can refer to trilateral relations as multilateral. These days, we often refer to it as minilateral. In that sense, I think that there's a real growth of cooperation among Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo to build robust deterrence. That is not just Korean Peninsula deterrence vis-a-vis North Korea, but rather a regional deterrent. And there are a lot of very smart people in Washington, Tokyo, and in the security and defense community here in Seoul who are trying to think about what it would mean for South Korea to be involved in a sort of dual deterrent relationship vis-a-vis both North Korea and potentially China. So if that's what we mean, there's obviously something there. Frankly speaking, right now, the way that the United States is acting towards its allies makes one wonder how sustainable that is over time. But at least for the moment, it's there and much more robust and alive than perhaps the situation with the United States vis-a-vis Europe. If you mean, however, true multilateral cooperation involving China as a partner, I really just don't see that happening. China has no interest in that. And as I said, the sort of larger global security evolution right now is more towards great powers acting unilaterally than in any multilateral context. And China has always been sort of allergic to that notion of regional security architecture in the first place. And this is certainly, I think, not a propitious moment in the international system for China to all of a sudden change its tune. So I don't really imagine that would be the case.
Thank you for that opinion, Professor Richey. Now, let's also touch upon the cultural issues. President Lee hinted that the 한한령, the Hallyu ban, may be easing using metaphors including melting ice and also ripening fruit. Professor Min, do you think this is a genuine opening for Korean content, any cultural exchange to make a comeback in China?
Yes, that personally, I think that Hallyu ban, 한한령, will gradually be easing over time, like President Xi's metaphor of melting ice and ripening fruit. Again, through the two summits, the two countries, South Korea and China, showed their intention to build their mutually beneficial relationship where the two countries can enhance cooperation in practical areas such as economic, technological, cultural, and people-to-people exchanges. So the cultural exchange and cooperation will be more activated in the coming years, and therefore there would be a gradual opening for Korean content based on the popularity of K-culture, and there would be more active people-to-people exchanges based on the raise the favorability between about the South Korea and the China among the people in both countries. So it is expected that South Korea-China relationship will be continued to be enhanced in the coming months and years. Like the President Xi mentioned, time will resolve everything.
So it seemed to be a stepping stone in terms of the easing of 한한령 moving forward. We will look forward to that. But I'm afraid we'll have to conclude our discussion right here tonight. Thank you so much for your insights, Professor Min.
Thank you.
And of course, Professor Richey, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame tonight. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.